Tacoma, Washington looked exactly the way a safe place was supposed to look. Tree-lined streets, neighborhood parks filled with afternoon light, families who believed that daylight still meant protection. This was a time before warning signs stood at playground entrances, before parents tracked their children by phone, before fear arrived through constant alerts. In 1986, parks were where children went to breathe freely, where families gathered without hesitation, where trust lived quietly without needing to be explained. And that is what makes this story difficult to understand. Because in that same summer, in those same parks, two young girls would lose their lives, months apart, in separate places, yet become bound together in the public mind almost immediately. Not by evidence, not by certainty, but by fear. The fear had a name in the 1980s. People called it stranger danger. It was the idea that danger came from the outside, from someone unknown, from someone who didn't belong. And once that idea took hold, it shaped everything that followed. Tacoma in 1986 was not a city expecting something like this. It was a working community. Families knew their neighbors. Children walked to parks on their own. Public spaces were extensions of home. Parks especially were seen as neutral ground, shared ground, places where safety was assumed, not questioned. So when the first crime occurred, it did not arrive with clarity. It arrived with disbelief. There was no immediate explanation that made sense, no clear reason why a place designed for play could become a place of loss. And when the second crime happened, months later, something shifted. Two incidents, two parks, two young girls. That was enough. Enough for fear to begin filling the empty spaces where answers should have been. By the mid-1980s, the idea of childhood safety was already changing across America. Television news carried stories from far away. Milk cartons bore unfamiliar faces. Parents were being told quietly and repeatedly that danger could appear anywhere. Tacoma absorbed those messages just like every other city. So when tragedy struck, not once, but twice, the community did what communities often do when faced with uncertainty. They searched for a single explanation, one threat, one person, one reason. It felt safer that way because believing in a single source of danger made the world feel more manageable. It suggested that if that one person could be found, everything else could return to normal. But this story does not begin with clarity. It begins with assumption. The assumption that proximity meant connection, that timing meant intent, that fear itself could be used as evidence. The public conversation moved quickly. The idea took shape almost immediately. The same person must be responsible. It was repeated in quiet conversations, in headlines, in worried glances exchanged at park entrances. And once that idea took hold, it became difficult to let go. What is often forgotten is how little was actually known in those early months. The two crimes happened in different parks, at different times, under different circumstances. But the human mind is drawn to patterns, especially when fear is involved. Fear does not wait patiently for facts. It fills the gaps. And in 1986, there were many gaps. This was an era before instant information, no social media, no online databases, no rapid public corrections. What people heard first often stayed with them the longest. And what they heard, again and again, was the idea of a single unseen threat moving through familiar spaces, a figure without a face, a danger without a name. That idea settled into Tacoma like a shadow that did not move quickly, but did not leave either. The parks themselves did not change. The paths remained open. The trees still cast shade. The playgrounds still stood where they always had. But something else changed. Parents watched more closely. Children were called home earlier. Trust, once automatic, became conditional, and the assumption that both crimes were connected hardened into something rarely questioned. This is how stories begin to form before investigations are complete. Calm, measured pacing. But because fear demands meaning, it demands explanation, and when answers are slow to arrive, fear provides its own. The question this case asks is not only about who was responsible, it is about how conclusions are reached. What happens when fear fills the gaps before evidence does? What happens when two separate tragedies are linked by assumption rather than proof? And how long can a belief survive once it has been accepted as truth? Because for more than 30 decades, one idea shaped how these crimes were remembered. One story stood in place of two, and it would take science many years later to show how wrong that story was. This is not just the story of two crimes. It is the story of how fear can quietly shape understanding, how assumptions can outlast facts, and how sometimes the truth waits patiently for the right moment to be heard. This is the story of a fearful summer in Tacoma and the consequences of believing we already knew the answer.
Before there were headlines, before there were assumptions, before fear reshaped how people spoke about parks and safety, there were two children living ordinary lives in Tacoma, Washington. They were not symbols, they were not case numbers, they were not part of a pattern. They were Michella Welch, and they were Jennifer Bastian. And everything about this story begins with understanding who they were, separately. Michella Welch was 12 years old in the summer of 1986. She lived with her family in Tacoma in a household shaped by routine and familiarity. She had responsibilities. She had expectations. She had a daily life that made sense to her. Like many children her age, Michella spent time outdoors. She walked to nearby places she knew well. She moved through her neighborhood with the quiet confidence that comes from repetition. There was nothing unusual about her day, nothing that signaled danger, nothing that marked it as different from any other. Parks were part of that normal rhythm. They were places children passed through without thinking twice, places parents allowed them to go because those places had always been safe. Michella did not leave her home believing she was stepping into risk. She left believing she was stepping into familiarity. Jennifer was 10 years old. She lived in a different household, a different family, a different routine. Her daily life did not overlap with Michella's. They did not walk the same paths. They did not share schedules. Jennifer was younger, but like many children in Tacoma at the time, she was growing up in a culture that encouraged independence within known boundaries. Parks were those boundaries. They were public, open, and trusted. They were designed for children like Jennifer, places to walk, to play, to pass time while the day unfolded. Jennifer's routines were shaped by that trust. She moved through her environment believing it was watched over, believing that adults nearby would notice if something went wrong, believing that being in public meant being seen. That belief was shared by her family, by her community, by the city itself. What matters here is not how Michella and Jennifer were similar, it is how separate their lives were. Two different families, two different daily rhythms, two different moments in time. They were not connected by friendship. They were not connected by circumstance. They were connected only later by assumption. When we talk about cases like this, it is easy to compress lives into brief descriptions, an age, a date, a location. But those details flatten what mattered most. Michella had a place in her family. Jennifer had a place in hers. They were known by name, called home at night, expected back.
Their absence was not abstract, it was immediate, personal, disruptive. Both girls lived in a time when childhood independence was common. In 1986, children were expected to move through their neighborhoods on their own. They walked, they biked, they visited parks without supervision. This was not neglect, it was normal. Parents trusted public spaces because they always had, and Tacoma's parks were central to that trust. They were not hidden corners of the city. They were open areas meant to bring people together. Children did not go there to disappear. They went there because everyone went there. This is why the impact of these crimes spread so quickly. It was not just grief, it was recognition. Parents saw their own children in Michella and Jennifer. They saw routines that mirrored their own households. Nothing about these girls suggested risk. They were not defying rules. They were not seeking isolation. They were participating in daily life as it was understood at the time. Michella's family noticed when she did not return as expected. Jennifer's family felt the same sudden absence. In both cases, concern arrived quickly because these were children who followed routines, children who were expected back, children whose absence was immediately wrong. There was no delay in realizing something had changed. What followed for their families was not just loss, it was confusion. How could something happen in a place meant for safety? How could public spaces fail so completely? How could normal days end this way? Those questions echoed far beyond their homes. They reached other families, other parents, other children. And slowly, they began to reshape how Tacoma saw itself. But at this point in the story, it is important to pause before assumptions hardened, before the cases were linked in the public mind, before one explanation replaced many unknowns. Michella Welch was a 12-year-old girl living her life. Jennifer Bastian was a 10-year-old girl living hers. They did not share a story. They each had one of their own. When people later spoke about the cases, something was lost, because what was truly lost first were two separate lives, two voices that never reached adulthood, two childhoods that ended before they had the chance to grow. Their names deserve to be spoken clearly, not as part of a theory, not as part of a timeline, but as children who were present, known, and loved. The shared vulnerability of childhood is what connects them now, not a single explanation, not a single assumption, but the fact that children rely on the structures around them. They rely on adults. They rely on trust. They rely on public spaces functioning as intended. In 1986, those structures failed both Michella and Jennifer, but they did so in ways that would not be fully understood for decades. This act is not about conclusions. It is about context. It is about remembering that before fear reshaped the narrative, there were two girls living ordinary lives, lives that mattered independently, lives that should not be merged simply because it feels easier. These were not statistics. These were children known by name. And in order to understand what went wrong, we must remember who they were before the assumptions began. Because the truth of this case does not start with answers. It starts with two lives that deserved far more time than they were given.
By the time summer turned toward autumn in 1986, Tacoma was no longer just a city of routines and familiar paths. It had become a place where questions moved faster than answers. Two children, two parks, two moments separated by months. And yet, from the very beginning, those details were often spoken in the same breath. The first location was a public park in Tacoma, an open space designed for families, recreation, and daylight use, a place that existed not on the edge of the city, but within it.
It was not hidden. It was not remote. It was a space people passed through regularly. The second location was another park, separate, with its own layout, its own surrounding streets, its own patterns of daily activity, different paths, different entry points, different surroundings. What they shared was not geography. What they shared was visibility. Both parks were public spaces. Both were used by families. Both were active during daylight hours. These details mattered because from the earliest reports, visibility became the focus. The idea that something could happen in open, shared spaces unsettled the city. And so, when information reached the public, it was filtered through that unease. The time gap between the two crimes was measured in months, not days, not weeks, months. That separation mattered to investigators, even when it did not matter as much to public perception. Time has a way of compressing events when fear is involved. What happened in early summer and what happened later that year began to feel closer together than they actually were. The calendar said months apart. Emotion made them feel connected. The ages of Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian were also noted quickly. 12, 10, close enough, many assumed, to suggest similarity. Both children, both young, both vulnerable. But age range alone does not establish connection. It establishes category, and category can be misleading. Early reporting emphasized these surface similarities. 2 young girls, 2 parks, 2 incidents within the same city. Headlines placed them side by side, not because evidence demanded it, but because the public needed a framework. Fear seeks structure, and when answers are missing, similarity becomes a substitute. Investigators, however, were more cautious. They documented locations separately. They treated timelines independently. They gathered information without assuming overlap. But the pressure surrounding the cases was intense. Communities wanted clarity. Families wanted reassurance. The city wanted to understand what it was facing. And in that environment, parallels became louder than distinctions. What investigators knew at this stage was limited. They knew the locations, they knew the times, they knew the identities of the victims. They knew these were serious crimes that demanded attention. What they did not know was whether there was a single cause behind both events. They did not know if one individual was responsible. They did not know if the cases were connected at all. Those answers were not available in 1986. Public spaces played a significant role in shaping assumptions. If something happens in private, people tend to isolate it. If it happens in public, they generalize it. Parks are shared environments. They belong to everyone. And when something goes wrong in a shared space, fear spreads quickly because it feels transferable. If it happened there, it could happen anywhere. That logic fueled early connections between the cases. Daylight hours further complicated perception. These were not late-night incidents. They did not occur under cover of darkness. They happened during times when people believed visibility offered protection. And so the question became louder. If daylight and public spaces were not enough, what was? For investigators, the work was methodical. They examined each park individually. They looked at access points. They considered patterns of use. They spoke with people who had been present. They documented movements and routines. What they did not do was declare a single explanation, because at this stage there was no factual basis for doing so. But outside investigative rooms, the narrative took shape quickly. People spoke of the park cases. They spoke of a single threat, not because it was proven, but because it made fear easier to name. A single danger feels containable. Multiple unknowns do not. This distinction matters because once cases are linked in the public consciousness, it becomes difficult to separate them later. Every new detail is interpreted through that lens. Every lead is weighed against an assumed connection. And sometimes that assumption delays clarity rather than bringing it closer. At this point in time, investigators were still gathering. They had facts, but not conclusions. They had questions, but not answers. They were operating within the limits of the era. No comprehensive digital databases, no rapid cross-referencing tools, no advanced forensic comparisons available on demand. Everything took time, and time in moments like this can distort perception. The proximity of the parks within the same city also played a role. Tacoma is not a vast, sprawling metropolis. Events within city limits feel closer together, even if neighborhoods differ. People mapped the incidents mentally. They drew lines that felt logical emotionally, even if they were untested factually. It is important to emphasize what investigators did not know. They did not know whether the same individual had access to both parks. They did not know if there was overlap in circumstances. They did not know if similarities were meaningful or coincidental. Those distinctions were still forming. At this stage, the cases existed side by side, not merged. But the seeds of assumption had already been planted. Because similarity is compelling. It offers an illusion of understanding, and when people are afraid, that illusion can be powerful. This act is not about conclusions. It's about laying out the facts as they were understood at the time. 2 parks, 2 crimes, months apart, public spaces, daylight hours, surface similarities that felt significant, even when deeper connections had not been established. The key idea here is simple, but often overlooked. Similarity does not equal connection. And in 1986, that difference would shape how this story unfolded for decades. Because once cases are linked in the public consciousness, separating them requires more than evidence. It requires patience, it requires restraint, and it requires the willingness to accept that fear can sometimes draw lines where facts cannot. As investigators continued their work, they did so under the weight of expectation. The city wanted answers, families wanted certainty, the public wanted reassurance, and all of it rested on a question that could not yet be answered. Were these 2 events part of the same story? At this point in time, no one could say. Only that 2 children were gone, 2 parks were forever changed, and a city was learning in real time how quickly assumption can fill the space where facts have not yet arrived.
By the time the second case entered public awareness, something subtle had already begun to form. Not evidence, not confirmation, a story. It was a story shaped less by facts and more by repetition. 2 crimes in the same city, 2 young victims, 2 public parks. The details were spoken again and again until they began to sound like certainty. Media coverage played a central role. Newspaper headlines placed the cases near each other on the page. Broadcast segments referenced earlier reports while introducing new ones. Language began to overlap. Phrases like "another incident" and "yet again" appeared. Without explicitly stating a connection, the structure of the reporting suggested one. Side-by-side presentation creates association, and association, repeated often enough, becomes belief. The public did not receive the cases as separate files. They received them as a developing narrative. Each new update was filtered through what had already been heard. When people saw park footage on the evening news, they did not ask which park. They asked how this could keep happening. Fear consolidated quickly. Parents talked to other parents. Schools sent notices. Community meetings grew crowded. The idea of a single threat was easier to explain than the possibility of unrelated events. A single story feels manageable. Multiple unknowns do not. The phrase "one predator" began to circulate. It did not originate from confirmed findings. It emerged from repetition, from the human need to connect dots even when the picture is incomplete. The mind seeks patterns, especially under stress, and once a pattern feels established, it resists change. Law enforcement felt the pressure, not to solve two cases, but to stop what was being perceived as a continuing pattern. When the public believes there is one individual responsible, every unsolved case becomes part of a countdown. The question shifts from "what happened" to "when will it happen again?" That shift matters. Investigators were now operating under heightened expectation. Every lead was measured against the idea of a single individual. Every suspect was evaluated not just for one case, but for both. This approach was not reckless, it was understandable. When similarities dominate conversation, separating cases can appear dismissive, and no one wanted to appear unconcerned. Media framing reinforced this direction. Visuals showed timelines merging, graphics aligned dates and locations. Park images were shown side by side, inviting comparison. The message was not spoken outright, but it was clear. This is one story. Language shaped perception. Words like "again" and "another" implied continuation. They suggested sequence, and sequence implies intent. Before long, the question was no longer whether the cases were connected, it was how one person could move undetected. Repetition has power. When an idea is heard often enough, it stops sounding like theory. It begins to sound like fact. That is how belief forms without confirmation, not through deception, but through familiarity. Community fear simplified complexity. It reduced two investigations into a single focus. That simplification brought temporary clarity, but it also narrowed the lens. When everything points toward one explanation, alternatives become quieter. They do not disappear, they simply receive less attention. The danger of early conclusions lies not in intention, but in momentum. Once a story gains traction, it carries people with it. Questions are framed differently, leads are prioritized differently, resources follow the narrative, and changing course later becomes difficult. Investigators still documented differences, they still tracked details independently, but outside those rooms, the story had already settled. The city believed it understood what it was facing: a single figure, a single source of fear. Newspaper headlines from the era reflect this shift. They do not always say "same suspect," but they imply continuity. They link timelines, they merge imagery. The layout itself tells a story. Side-by-side park imagery became common. One bench, another path. Two locations presented as variations of the same place. The visual language mattered. It suggested sameness even where differences existed. Timeline graphics reinforced the idea. Dates aligned vertically, markers stacked. The space between months shrank on screen. What had once been separated by time now appeared almost adjacent. This was not manipulation, it was storytelling, and storytelling fills gaps where certainty is missing. Law enforcement felt an additional layer of responsibility. If the public believed there was one ongoing danger, reassurance became urgent. Stopping a perceived pattern became as important as solving individual cases. That pressure can influence priorities. It can shape investigative focus, not because of error, but because of urgency. The one-story narrative dominated conversations, at work, at school, at home. People spoke as if the connection was established, as if the question had already been answered. But belief is not evidence, and repetition does not create truth. It only creates familiarity. This act of the story is not about assigning fault. It is about understanding how narratives form, how shared fear simplifies complexity,
how early assumptions, once widely accepted, can shape years of thinking. Because once a single story takes hold, it becomes the reference point. Every new detail is added to it, every unanswered question reinforces it, and every delay feels like confirmation that something is being missed. The rise of a single story brought focus, but it also brought risk. The risk of overlooking differences, the risk of ignoring alternate explanations, the risk of assuming connection where none has been proven. At this point in the timeline, the city believed it knew the shape of the problem. One individual, one pattern, one ongoing concern. The story felt complete, even without resolution. And yet, beneath that certainty, the cases themselves remained unresolved. Two separate investigations, two families waiting, two truths still undiscovered. What followed would test the strength of that single story, not immediately, not visibly, but over time, because stories built on assumption eventually face a reckoning. And when that happens, the hardest thing to accept is not that the story was wrong, but that it felt right for so long.
These were the primary instruments of progress. Tips came in. Some were detailed, some were vague, some conflicted with each other. Every tip had to be evaluated, every call logged, every lead considered, even when it led nowhere. This was slow work, careful work, and often frustrating work, because effort does not always bring answers. Investigations in the 1980s required patience. There was no instant cross-referencing across jurisdictions. Information sharing depended on phone calls, meetings, and mailed documents. If two investigators worked on similar cases miles apart, they might not know it immediately. Evidence comparison was manual. Notes were reviewed line by line. Photographs were studied repeatedly. Investigators looked for overlap, but they were limited by what was visible, and not everything important is visible right away. Witness memory was central, but memory is fragile. Stress alters perception. Fear sharpens some details and erases others. Time reshapes recollection. What seemed clear one day could blur the next. Investigators knew this. They worked within it. They asked follow-up questions. They re-interviewed when needed. They cross-checked statements against physical facts, but there were limits they could not cross. Public attention added pressure. People wanted reassurance. They wanted progress. They wanted certainty. But investigations cannot promise certainty on demand. Each team focused on what they could confirm, what could be placed on a timeline, what could be verified by more than one source. Rumors were set aside. Speculation was noted but not prioritized. Evidence was cataloged carefully, because even if it could not answer questions yet, it might one day. That idea guided preservation efforts, not optimism, preparation. The absence of DNA profiling meant that biological material remained silent. It waited, stored, labeled, protected. Not useless, just unreadable. Investigators understood the stakes. They were aware that every day without answers weighed on families. They felt the responsibility of that knowledge. But responsibility does not create tools. Tips slowed over time. Witnesses returned to routine. Memories faded. The initial surge of information thinned. This is common in investigations, not because people stop caring, but because life continues. Investigators continued working, reviewing, reassessing, looking for connections that could be supported by evidence, not assumption. There was no lack of effort. There was no lack of concern. There was no absence of professionalism. There was simply a gap between questions and the ability to answer them. The cases did not stall because of neglect. They slowed because the era imposed limits. Limits of science, limits of technology, limits of human recall. Investigators preserved what they could. They documented what they knew. They kept records that would later become critical, even if they could not know that at the time. This act of the story matters because it challenges a common misconception that unresolved cases are the result of inaction. Often, they are the result of timing. In 1986, the investigative framework relied on persistence rather than precision. It required trust in process, trust that preserving evidence mattered, even if it could not yet be interpreted. Families waited. Investigators continued. The public watched. And the cases remained open, not abandoned, not forgotten, waiting. Because effort does not guarantee resolution, but it does create the foundation for future answers. And in 1986, that foundation was quietly being laid, piece by piece, label by label, interview by interview. The story did not pause. It simply moved into a long, quiet chapter, one defined not by action on the surface, but by preparation beneath it.
After the early investigations slowed, something else took their place. Silence. Not the silence of forgetting, but the silence of unanswered questions settling into daily life. No arrests were made. No public announcements brought resolution. The cases remained open but unchanged, and time began to move differently. For the families, waiting became part of existence. Days turned into months, months stretched into years. Every phone call carried possibility. Every unfamiliar number sparked a pause. But most days ended the same way they began, without news. Waiting does not stand still. It reshapes people. Families learned how to function alongside uncertainty. Birthdays arrived. Holidays passed. Milestones were marked with an absence that could not be filled. There was no moment when waiting ended. It simply became routine, a quiet companion that never left. In the wider community, life continued. Parks reopened. Children returned to playgrounds. Season after season, grass grew back. Paths were maintained. Benches were repainted. On the surface, normalcy returned, but memory lingered. Parents watched more closely. Conversations changed. Rules shifted. The idea of safety was no longer assumed. It had to be negotiated. Over time, a belief settled into place. The belief that both crimes were connected, that one person was responsible. This idea had taken hold early, and with no new information to challenge it, it remained. Assumptions harden when they are left untested. They become stories people tell themselves to make sense of fear. One explanation feels easier than many. One source feels easier than uncertainty. The same killer belief became part of local memory. It was repeated in conversations. It appeared in media references. It shaped how the cases were discussed, even years later. And repetition creates permanence, even without proof. Archived case files grew thicker. Reports were revisited. Evidence inventories were checked. But without new tools, nothing changed. The material waited. Investigators changed roles. Some retired. Some moved on. New names appeared on files, reading through old notes written by others. They inherited questions that had no answers. Each new review brought the same realization. There was nothing missing, only something unavailable. For the families, the emotional cost accumulated quietly. Grief did not move forward, it stayed in place. Because resolution is what allows grief to change shape. Without it, grief remains open. Waiting decades is not passive. It requires endurance. It demands strength that is rarely visible. Families learned how to carry two lives at once, the life they lived and the life that paused. Community memory faded unevenly. Some residents remembered clearly,
Others moved away. New families arrived who knew nothing of what had happened. The parks looked ordinary again, but for some, they never were. Seasonal changes became markers of time. Leaves falling, snow melting, summer returning. Each cycle passed without answers. The cases did not disappear, they aged, and aging changes perception. What once felt urgent began to feel distant to those not directly affected. But distance did not reduce importance, it only reduced attention. Assumptions persisted because they were never challenged by evidence. There was no moment that forced reconsideration, no announcement that shifted the narrative, so the story stayed the same. This is how unanswered questions become permanent, not because no one cares, but because there is nothing new to say. Archived case files became symbols, folders holding moments frozen in time, paper aging, photographs fading slightly, but the questions inside unchanged. The long silence did not mean nothing was happening. It meant everything was waiting. Evidence, families, truth. And waiting carries weight. It shapes identity. It alters how people understand justice. It teaches patience without promise. For decades, the cases lived quietly, in storage rooms, in memories, in assumptions passed down without verification. The silence was not empty. It was full of unanswered questions. And unanswered questions have a way of staying. Because without new information, belief becomes substitute, and belief, once settled, resists change. This was the cost of waiting, not just time, but certainty. And yet, beneath that silence, something important remained. Evidence preserved, records intact, questions still open. The story had not ended. It had simply entered its longest pause, one measured not in days or years, but in decades.
After the initial investigation slowed, the absence of answers did not bring relief. It brought a different kind of presence, one that settled quietly into daily life. There were no arrests announced, no court dates to mark on calendars, no moments that signaled movement toward resolution. The cases remained open but unchanged, and time began to stretch in unfamiliar ways. For the families, waiting became part of the rhythm of life. Days moved forward, then weeks, then years, each one carrying the same question forward without reply. Phone calls were answered with a pause. Letters were opened carefully. Every interaction carried the smallest hope that something had finally shifted. Yet most days ended exactly as they began, with nothing new to hold on to. Waiting did not feel active, but it was never still. It reshaped routines, expectations, and the way families learned to move through the world. Birthdays arrived without celebration. Holidays passed with a presence that could not be named, but was always felt. Life continued because it had to, yet it continued alongside uncertainty that never loosened its grip. In the wider community, adaptation took a different form. Parks reopened, paths were maintained, children returned to playgrounds, sometimes watched more closely than before, sometimes with rules that had not existed the previous summer. Tacoma adjusted, not through announcements or ceremonies, but through small changes that accumulated quietly. Parents talked differently. Neighborhoods paid more attention. Trust in public spaces became something discussed rather than assumed. Over time, normal routines resumed, but they did so with caution woven into them. Parks that once symbolized openness and shared space now carried layered meaning depending on who walked through them and what they remembered. For some residents, these locations became ordinary again. For others, they never fully returned to that state. Memory does not fade evenly across a community. It clings where it is needed most and softens where distance allows it to. As years passed without resolution, one idea settled more firmly into place. The belief that both crimes were committed by the same person had taken hold early, and without new information to challenge it, the belief hardened. It was repeated in conversations, referenced in passing, and carried forward through time as though it were fact rather than assumption. When an explanation is repeated often enough, it begins to feel stable. One story feels easier to carry than many possibilities. One cause feels more manageable than uncertainty. This belief offered a sense of structure in a situation defined by its absence of clarity. Without arrests, without trials, without conclusions, the mind seeks order wherever it can find it. Over time, the same killer idea became less a theory and more a background truth, accepted without question simply because nothing had arrived to replace it. Assumptions persist when they are not tested. They grow stronger not because they are proven, but because they are familiar. In the absence of new evidence, the narrative remained untouched, passed down through memory, through archived reporting, through the quiet language of what everyone knows. This is how unanswered questions become permanent, not because people stop caring, but because there is nothing new to examine. Silence allows belief to fill space, and once belief settles in, it resists change. For investigators, this period was defined by maintenance rather than momentum. Case files were preserved, evidence was logged and stored, reports were revisited occasionally, often with the same outcome. There was nothing missing, nothing mishandled, nothing obviously overlooked. There was simply nothing more the era could offer. The tools available at the time had already been used. What remained was patience, and patience without a clear endpoint carries its own weight. As years turned into decades, the emotional cost became more apparent. For families, grief did not move forward, it remained suspended. Closure is what allows grief to change shape, to transform into remembrance rather than unanswered longing. Without it, grief stays open. It becomes something people learn to carry rather than something they move beyond. Families learned to exist alongside questions that never resolved. They learned to speak about their loved ones in ways that honored life without reopening wounds that never fully healed. This endurance was not visible, but it was constant. Waiting decades is not passive. It requires strength, restraint, and resilience that rarely receive recognition. It means living with two timelines at once, the life that continues and the moment that never concluded. In the wider community, adaptation took a different form. Parks reopened, paths were maintained, children returned to playgrounds, sometimes watched more closely than before, sometimes with rules that had not existed the previous summer. Tacoma adjusted, not through announcements or ceremonies, but through small changes that accumulated quietly. Parents talked differently. Neighborhoods paid more attention. Trust in public spaces became something discussed rather than assumed. Over time, normal routines resumed, but they did so with caution woven into them. Parks that once symbolized openness and shared space now carried layered meaning, depending on who walked through them and what they remembered. For some residents, these locations became ordinary again. For others, they never fully returned to that state. Memory does not fade evenly across a community. It clings where it is needed most and softens where distance allows it to. As years passed without resolution, one idea settled more firmly into place.
The belief that both crimes were committed by the same person had taken hold early, and without new information to challenge it, the belief hardened. It was repeated in conversations, referenced in passing, and carried forward through time as though it were fact rather than assumption. When an explanation is repeated often enough, it begins to feel stable. One story feels easier to carry than many possibilities. One cause feels more manageable than uncertainty. This belief offered a sense of structure in a situation defined by its absence of clarity. Without arrests, without trials, without conclusions, the mind seeks order wherever it can find it. Over time, the same killer idea became less a theory and more a background truth, accepted without question simply because nothing had arrived to replace it. Assumptions persist when they are not tested. They grow stronger not because they are proven, but because they are familiar. In the absence of new evidence, the narrative remained untouched, passed down through memory, through archived reporting, through the quiet language of what everyone knows. This is how unanswered questions become permanent, not because people stop caring, but because there is nothing new to examine. Silence allows belief to fill space, and once belief settles in, it resists change. For investigators, this period was defined by maintenance rather than momentum. Case files were preserved, evidence was logged and stored, reports were revisited occasionally, often with the same outcome. There was nothing missing, nothing mishandled, nothing obviously overlooked. There was simply nothing more the era could offer. The tools available at the time had already been used. What remained was patience, and patience without a clear endpoint carries its own weight. As years turned into decades, the emotional cost became more apparent. For families, grief did not move forward, it remained suspended. Closure is what allows grief to change shape, to transform into remembrance rather than unanswered longing. Without it, grief stays open. It becomes something people learn to carry, rather than something they move beyond. Families learned to exist alongside questions that never resolved. They learned to speak about their loved ones in ways that honored life without reopening wounds that never fully healed. This endurance was not visible, but it was constant. Waiting decades is not passive. It requires strength, restraint, and resilience that rarely receive recognition. It means living with two timelines at once, the life that continues and the moment that never concluded. In the wider community, adaptation took a different form. Parks reopened, paths were maintained, children returned to playgrounds, sometimes watched more closely than before, sometimes with rules that had not existed.
As the years continued to pass, something important remained quietly intact, even as assumptions hardened and public attention softened. Evidence endured. It did not demand attention, and it did not offer answers on its own, but it stayed preserved, waiting in controlled spaces designed to protect what time might otherwise erase. From the earliest days of the investigations, materials connected to each case were handled separately, cataloged with care, and stored according to the standards of the era. At the time, this separation reflected the understanding investigators had then. The cases were treated as distinct events, examined individually, each with its own files, its own records, and its own unanswered questions. That structure, built decades earlier, would later prove to be essential. Preservation was not guided by certainty, it was guided by responsibility. No one could know how science would evolve, but there was a clear understanding that evidence, once lost, could never be replaced. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, forensic storage itself began to change. Facilities improved, temperature control became more precise, handling procedures grew more standardized. Items that once sat in simple containers were now sealed, labeled, and monitored with a level of consistency that reflected a growing respect for the future value of physical material. These improvements were not made with any single case in mind. They were part of a broader shift in how justice systems prepared for what might come next. Evidence was no longer viewed only as something to be examined immediately. It was understood as something that might need to speak later, in ways that had not yet been imagined. This change in perspective quietly extended the life of unanswered cases, even as the people connected to them continued waiting. As forensic science advanced, DNA profiling began to enter public awareness. At first, it was limited in scope and application. Early methods required large samples and produced results that could only be compared against known individuals or small databases. In the beginning, DNA was a promising idea rather than a practical solution. It offered potential but not certainty. For many cold cases, including those from the mid-1980s, DNA existed in theory but not yet in reach. The science was still finding its footing. Equipment was evolving. Standards were still being written. What mattered most during this period was not immediate progress, but the realization that preserved material could one day be examined in ways previously unavailable. Cold case units began to emerge within law enforcement agencies as a response to this growing possibility. These units were built around patience and review rather than urgency. Their purpose was not to chase new leads in real time, but to return to old files with updated tools and fresh perspective. Investigators assigned to these units often worked cases older than their own careers. They inherited records written by others, sometimes decades earlier, and approached them with both respect and restraint. Revisiting a case did not mean rewriting it. It meant asking whether something preserved long ago could now answer questions that once had no voice. Each file review was an exercise in humility. It acknowledged that earlier efforts were not failures, but reflections of the limits of their time. The value of preservation became clearer with each technological advance. Evidence that once seemed silent began to hold new meaning. Items stored away for decades were no longer just remnants of the past. They were potential sources of clarity. This shift did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually as science proved itself reliable, repeatable, and capable of handling the responsibility placed upon it. DNA profiling became more sensitive, smaller samples became usable, comparisons became more accurate. The question was no longer whether evidence could speak, but whether it had been protected well enough to do so. Time changed the meaning of everything connected to these cases. Early assumptions, once repeated often enough to feel solid, began to appear less certain when examined alongside new possibilities. What had once been framed as a single story now invited reconsideration. Preservation mattered more than belief. Evidence did not carry opinions or narratives. It carried information, waiting for the right moment to be understood. This realization reshaped how investigators approached long-standing cases. Rather than asking whether old theories still held, they began asking whether the material itself had ever been fully heard. Revisiting files required discipline. It meant setting aside decades of shared understanding and returning to original documentation. Reports were read again, not for confirmation, but for context. Photographs were examined without the influence of long-held conclusions. Storage logs were reviewed to ensure continuity. Every step reinforced the same principle: certainty can fade, but preserved evidence remains. This process was not dramatic. It involved quiet rooms, careful handling, and detailed documentation. It was slow, deliberate work, grounded in the belief that patience could be rewarded. Old evidence brought new questions rather than immediate answers. Each advance in science raised the same fundamental issue: what else might be possible now that was not possible before? This did not mean rewriting history. It meant expanding the range of what history could reveal.
Cold case units did not approach evidence with expectations. They approached it with openness. The goal was not to prove earlier conclusions right or wrong, but to allow preserved material to offer whatever information it still held. This shift in mindset marked an important turning point. The focus moved away from assumptions and towards verification. Preservation also carried an ethical dimension. Evidence represents trust, not only from victims and families, but from the public. Honoring it believes that time should not decide whether answers are possible. Every sealed container, every maintained record, reflected a commitment to accountability that extended beyond individual careers and even beyond generations. Investigators understood their role was not to solve every case immediately, but to ensure that future efforts were not hindered by preventable loss. As decades passed, the importance of this approach became undeniable. Cases once thought permanently unresolved now had pathways forward. Not all would lead to clarity, but the opportunity existed because something essential had been preserved. Time, which once worked against resolution, began to work alongside it. Advances in forensic science did not erase the past. They offered new ways to listen to it. Old evidence, when viewed through modern methods, no longer belonged solely to the era in which it was collected. It became part of an ongoing conversation between past and present. This was the quiet power of preservation. It did not promise answers, it created the conditions for them. It allowed cases to endure without being forgotten, and it ensured that when science finally caught up to questions asked decades earlier, those questions would still have something to respond to. Evidence outlasted assumptions, not because they challenged them directly, but because it waited patiently, unchanged, until the world was ready to understand it differently.
For more than 3 decades, the story of these two cases moved forward on a shared track. The belief that a single individual was responsible became embedded in public memory, repeated often enough to feel settled. That belief shaped how the cases were discussed, how they were remembered, and how they were explained to new generations. It offered a form of order in the absence of answers. One explanation for 2 losses. One source for a long season of fear. But science does not respond to belief. It responds to data, process, and verification. And when modern DNA testing finally entered the story, it did so without regard for what people thought they already knew. The decision to apply updated DNA analysis came from a place of quiet persistence rather than urgency. Cold case investigators, working years after the original inquiries, approached the preserved evidence with care shaped by experience. The purpose was not to confirm a theory, but to let the material speak on its own terms. Advances in forensic science had reached a point where smaller samples could be tested with greater precision. Techniques that did not exist in 1986 were now reliable, repeatable, and widely accepted. This was not experimental work. It was established science, guided by strict protocols and peer-reviewed methods. Each case was examined separately, just as it had been preserved separately. This distinction mattered. The evidence connected to Michella Welch was processed on its own path. The evidence connected to Jennifer Bastian followed another. There was no assumption of overlap built into the testing itself. Laboratories focused on what the samples could reveal, not on how they might fit an existing narrative. This separation ensured that the results would be clear, unbiased, and defensible. The process was slow, deliberate, and methodical, reflecting the responsibility carried by any finding that might change decades of understanding. As results began to take shape, they did not arrive with spectacle. There were no dramatic announcements at first, no immediate public statements. Instead, there was careful review. Analysts verified the profiles. Independent checks were made. Procedures were repeated to ensure accuracy. What emerged from this process was not ambiguity, it was clarity.
The DNA profiles associated with the two cases did not match. They did not share markers. They did not point back to a single source. Scientifically, unequivocally, they were separate. This was the moment when a long-held assumption quietly fell away. For years, the idea of one person responsible for both crimes had guided conversation and memory. It had shaped fear and fueled speculation. But the genetic evidence left no room for interpretation. The cases were not linked by a single individual. They never had been. The science did not suggest a possibility. It delivered a conclusion. The story that had been told for decades no longer aligned with the facts now available. What DNA clarified was not just the identity question. It clarified the limits of assumption. It demonstrated how easily patterns can be constructed when information is incomplete. Two events, close in time and place, involving similar circumstances, can appear connected even when they are not. Human minds search for order, especially in moments of fear. In the absence of definitive answers, explanations form quickly. Over time, repetition turns those explanations into accepted truth. DNA testing interrupted that process, not by challenging intention, but by offering evidence that stood independent of interpretation. This correction did not diminish the seriousness of either case. It did not lessen the losses endured by the families. Instead, it reframed the truth. Each case now stood on its own, defined by its own facts rather than by comparison. The realization that two different individuals were responsible required a recalibration of understanding. It asked investigators, communities, and families to release a belief that at once seemed to make sense. That release was not easy, but it was necessary. Science does not assign meaning, it provides information. The meaning must then be integrated with care. For families who had lived for decades with a single explanation, the emergence of two separate profiles introduced new complexity. It did not bring immediate closure. In some ways, it reopened questions that had long been considered settled. But it also restored accuracy. And accuracy matters, especially when time has already taken so much. The collapse of the single killer theory revealed something important about how cases are remembered. Stories simplify over time. They become easier to tell, easier to hold. Complexity is often the first thing lost. DNA evidence returned complexity to the narrative, not as confusion, but as truth. It reminded everyone involved that early conclusions are not final conclusions, and that patience can be rewarded not just with answers, but with correction. This breakthrough also underscored the value of preservation. Without careful storage, without attention to detail across decades, this moment would not have been possible. The evidence had outlasted assumptions. It had waited quietly through years of certainty, ready to be examined when the tools finally existed to understand it fully. Time had not changed the material. It had changed what could be learned from it. For investigators, this moment reaffirmed the importance of revisiting old cases with fresh eyes. It demonstrated that progress does not always mean adding new information. Sometimes it means re-evaluating what is already there. DNA did not create a new story. It corrected an old one. And in doing so, it reshaped how these cases would be discussed moving forward. The statement that emerged from the testing was simple, but its implications were profound. It was never one man. That sentence carried weight not because it was dramatic, but because it was definitive. It replaced speculation with evidence. It asked for accountability to facts rather than familiarity. It reminded everyone that truth is not static. It evolves as understanding grows. In the end, DNA did not erase the past. It clarified it. It allowed the record to be adjusted in light of information that had once been unreachable. This moment was not about surprise. It was about responsibility. Responsibility to accuracy.
responsibility to memory, responsibility to the individuals at the center of the story, whose lives deserved to be understood as they were, not as they were assumed to be. As the results became part of the official record, the narrative shifted. Two cases, once bound together by fear and repetition, now stood apart. Each would move forward on its own path, guided by evidence rather than assumption. Science spoke, not loudly, but clearly, and in doing so, it changed everything that came next.
For more than 3 decades, the cases of Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian had been tied together in public perception and in investigative memory. The narrative of a single perpetrator had been repeated, assumed, and solidified over time, creating a story that felt complete even as questions lingered in the minds of families, law enforcement, and the community. It was a story built on proximity, age similarity, and the understandable human desire to make sense of tragedy. But truth is rarely simplified, and it does not conform to the shape of our assumptions. It waits for the right tools and the right process to emerge, and in this instance, it would take decades of preservation, advances in forensic science, and patient review to reveal what had always been there. The breakthrough that came in the 2010s did not arrive with fanfare or speculation. It came quietly, through careful, methodical work conducted by cold case units, revisiting evidence with tools that had been unavailable in 1986. DNA testing had advanced to a point where even decades-old biological material could yield reliable profiles. Investigators approached the preserved samples with a singular purpose: to determine what the material could tell them, independent of the narratives that had formed in its absence. For years, both cases had been studied, referenced, and compared under the assumption of a single offender, and that assumption had guided interviews, searches, and reporting. But science does not operate on assumptions, it operates on evidence, and evidence was about to redefine the entire understanding of these tragedies. Each case was reviewed separately. Michella Welch's case file, her preserved evidence, and her biological material were examined on their own. Jennifer Bastian's materials were examined independently. This separation was critical because it allowed the findings to be unbiased, grounded in the material itself rather than any expectation of connection. The work was meticulous, involving repeated analyses, cross-checking results, and validation by independent laboratories. It was not about speed or spectacle, it was about certainty and accountability. Every step was documented, every result confirmed. In the end, the DNA told a story that was clear, factual, and undeniable. These two crimes, once thought to be the work of a single individual, were in fact the work of two distinct perpetrators, two men, two separate acts of violence occurring months apart, but in two different contexts and against two separate children. The implications were significant. For the families, it was a confirmation that the tragedies they had endured were unique and needed to be understood individually. It clarified the record, acknowledging that each girl had been the victim of her own crime, deserving of specific attention and remembrance. For law enforcement and the public, it highlighted the value of revisiting cases with modern tools and reinforced the importance of evidence over assumption. It was a powerful lesson. Assumptions, however understandable, can create an illusion of clarity, while the truth may remain hidden in plain sight until the right methods are applied. Institutionally, the acknowledgement that two separate men had committed these crimes required a recalibration of decades of case files, investigative narratives, and public records. Previous statements that had linked the cases were corrected. The law recognized each case as distinct, not as part of a merged narrative. This correction did not diminish the investigative work of the past, nor did it question the dedication of the officers who had pursued leads over decades.
It simply reflected the capacity of science to provide precision, accountability, and clarity where human memory, perception, and societal narratives had reached their limits. Justice in this context was not a matter of dramatic confrontation or high-profile arrests. It was accountability through accuracy. The resolution came in the form of legal acknowledgement of separate perpetrators, the clear delineation of two distinct cases, and the public recognition that assumptions, even long-standing ones, must yield to verified evidence. The emphasis was not on speed or spectacle, it was on doing justice to the facts, to the families, and to the community that had lived with uncertainty for so long. Understanding the difference between one story and the actual truth allows for real closure to begin, even if it comes decades later. As the cases were formally separated, the narrative shifted. What had been a single, unified story, an assumption reinforced over 32 years, was replaced by two distinct truths. The community, families, and investigators now had a record that reflected reality. Two crimes, separated by months, linked by tragedy, but not by a common offender. The danger of simplification was replaced by the power of evidence. What had once been a single story that guided fear, shaped perception, and influenced investigative paths was now corrected by the clarity of DNA and scientific rigor. This understanding offers broader lessons. The 1980s were a time of heightened awareness of stranger danger, a period when the perceived threats in parks, neighborhoods, and public spaces influenced how children were supervised and how communities discussed safety. Assumptions about crime patterns emerged from both observation and fear, but these assumptions also had consequences. They framed investigations, influenced reporting, and shaped collective memory. When those assumptions persist unchallenged, even well-intentioned narratives can obscure distinct truths. Science, as in these cases, has the power to correct those narratives, not by undermining concern or empathy, but by restoring fidelity to fact. For families who had waited decades, the revelation of two separate perpetrators was not just a technical finding, it was a human one. Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian were no longer linked by assumption, but understood in their individuality. Each child's story could be told accurately, without conflating experiences or oversimplifying trauma. This allowed their lives to be remembered in detail, their circumstances respected, and their legacies defined by truth rather than by an imposed narrative. The cases also underscored the value of patience in investigative work. Decades-long waits can feel indefinite, but preservation of evidence, meticulous record-keeping, and ongoing review can yield transformative results. The DNA did not create new facts, it revealed what had always existed, waiting silently for methods capable of interpretation. Preservation, care, and scientific rigor allowed history to be corrected, ensuring that justice could finally be aligned with reality. As we reflect on this story, the meaning is clear. Fear and assumptions shaped the 1980s, and those assumptions shaped the perception of these cases. Science reshaped understanding, providing clarity where speculation had prevailed. Both girls deserved to have their stories recognized individually. Both cases deserved precise truths. The resolution was not immediate. It required decades of persistence, careful stewardship of evidence, and advances in technology. But the result is undeniable. Two crimes, two victims, two men, and for 32 years, a single story obscured that reality. The final lesson is one of accountability, remembrance, and respect for evidence. It is a reminder that the work of truth does not always happen quickly, but it can be enduring. The names of Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian, once overshadowed by assumption, now are accurately linked to their experiences, remembered distinctly, and acknowledged with clarity. Letting evidence speak does more than solve cases. It restores dignity, ensures historical accuracy, and honors the lives of those affected. In the end, the story of Michella and Jennifer is not simply about crime or investigation. It is about patience, science, and the importance of precision in understanding events that shape our communities. 2 children, 2 crimes, 2 truths. And in acknowledging that, we fulfill a responsibility that no assumption, however long-standing, can replace. Their stories now exist on their own terms, remembered, validated, and carried forward in truth.